Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Madar. I'm a co-director of the Institute of Spirituality and Social Justice here at Xavier, which includes our graduate program in theology. On behalf of the Institute, and together with the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue, Bellarmine Chapel, and St. Xavier Church, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening at the third presentation in the series titled Vatican II at 60. We have prepared this series because we want to bring attention to the Council as a gift to the Church, a gift whose reception is still in process. Our goal is not simply to rehash the decades-long debates regarding the Council or to memorialize a generational event, but rather to inquire into the Council's legacy for us today and to reflect on where we Catholics are in implementing the Council's vision. Our first two presentations focused on the reception of the Council's vision of the Church. Today we are shifting gears. Vatican II reshaped the relations between the Catholic Church and non-Christians with its declaration on the Church and non-Christian religions, which is typically referred to with its Latin title Nostra Aetate, which literally means in our time. It is in this document that the Council took on the question of the Church's relation to the Jewish people in general and such thorny topics as anti-Semitism, supersessionism, and deicide in particular. The reception of the Council's teaching on the Jewish people is what this presentation will be about. So let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Bill Madges is Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology at Xavier University, where he taught for 28 years, with 14 of those years spent as chair of the department. Bill also spent 12 years at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where he served as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and as Professor of Theology. Bill earned his PhD in Christian theology at the University of Chicago. His research has focused on the history of Christian thought, especially the period from the Reformation to the present. In addition to the 5 books he authored or co-authored, Bill edited 3 books on the Second Vatican Council and has translated several of the German publications of Cardinal Walter Kasper, including Mercy, The Essence of the Gospel and the Key to Christian Life, published in 2014, about which the late Pope Francis commented, "This book has done me so much good." Bill has also been engaged in interfaith work. One of his most significant accomplishments in this work is the co-creator of a multimedia exhibit entitled A Blessing to One Another, Pope John Paul II and the Jewish People, which toured the United States for 10 years before going on exhibit at the Vatican Museums in 2015. Together with 2 colleagues, he received the 9th Annual Eternal Light Award in 2008, presented by the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Leo University in Florida, for outstanding contribution in the cause of interfaith relations and human rights. Please welcome Dr. William Madges.
Thank you, Martin. So it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening and to review some of the key moments in the development of this changed relationship. It has a very long history, so I can only touch on certain aspects of it, and I'm going to let you know sort of how this evening will play out. I think it's really important first to set the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on this issue, as well as subsequent statements by the Catholic Church with regard to Jews and Judaism within the broader context of, namely, what did the Church say previously about Jews and Judaism, so that you can see some of the kind of tremendous transformation in terms of attitude and language. Then I'll briefly kind of pull out some of the key points of Nostra Aetate, and then lay out what I see as 4 of the key steps in terms of Catholic Church teaching with regard to this issue. And then, after we talk about the teaching, the last part of my presentation is to say, how does this change manifest itself in art, in prayer, in architecture? And so I'll just touch on some examples to show, if you will, visibly how there's been a change with regard to the teaching of the Church. So first, to talk about, I'm only pulling out 3 statements, right? So the first one is from the 13th century, the Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, which required distinctive dress for Jews, and it was intended to warn Christians to avoid having interaction with them, and certainly to avoid intermarriage. Okay? You'll see in the 15th century at the Council of Florence, here there's a general statement about who can be saved, right? And so it's very, very clear that, namely, one has to profess and teach what the Catholic Church teaches, or otherwise there's no hope for you. And you'll see they name groups by name, right? So, namely, what happens to pagans, Jews, heretics, and schismatics, and to give you a pretty visible picture of a painful fate. The last one is from the 16th century, when Pope Paul IV, during the time of the Counter-Reformation, established the ghetto in Rome. So this is in 1555. But look at the language used, so that, namely, Jews deserve this to be condemned by God to eternal slavery because they did not acknowledge Jesus as Messiah and Son of God, and that they were responsible for putting him to death. Rome was not the only place where there were ghettos, right? So there were ghettos throughout Europe. Ghettos were locked up at night. Jews had to be within the ghetto. They were restricted in terms of the occupations they could pursue, what they can do. They could not hold public office, etc., until the emancipation that began in Europe in the 18th century and later. So to give you an idea in terms of just official teaching of the Church, and you can imagine the impact that had on Jews, right? So that the relationship at the best of times was pretty bad. At the best of times. So, let's try this again. There we go. So, where I want to begin now is namely how we got to the Second Vatican Council. And here we really have to give great credit to Pope John XXIII, who within 90 days of having been elected Pope, announced that he wanted to convene an ecumenical council. And that puzzled a lot of cardinals who first heard that, because they're saying, what's the new heresy we're trying to stamp out, right? And he's saying, no, it's not a heresy we're trying to stamp out. Basically, we want to engage in aggiornamento. We want to update the Church. We want to open the windows and see if we can enter into dialogue with the modern world, with other Christians, with other religions. And that was part of what he wanted to do. And to the extent that it was possible, he said, it would be much better if we could try to find common ground with others, other religions, other Christians, etc., rather than simply engaging in condemnations on those places where they don't believe or act the same as we do. And the council opened in the fall of 1962. So what was this particular motivation? Because besides wanting a council to update the Church, there were a couple topics that were very special to him, and he wanted to make sure that the council would address. One of them was the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and other Christians. He was very much concerned about the unity of Christianity. And the other was the question of the Jews. During the Second World War, he was in the diplomatic corps. He served in Greece, in Turkey, and in the last part of the Second World War, he served in France. And using his diplomatic post, he engaged in distributing forged baptismal certificates and, in some cases, immigration visas, sending them off to the government in Bulgaria, for example, to try to save Jews from deportation and certain death. So they could produce a baptismal certificate saying, I'm a Christian, I'm not a Jew. So he did that, and he was very much touched by their suffering. A second impetus was really a meeting that he had in June of 1960 with Jules Isaac, a French historian who lost many members of his family in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. And back in 1947, so 2 years after the war, Isaac was responsible for creating the 10 Points of Salisbury. So this was a meeting in Switzerland where he tried to encourage Christian communities, it wasn't just Catholics, but Christian communities, how they might go about reforming their teaching about Jews, because what they have taught has consequences, right? And so in June of 1960, he was able to get a short meeting with John XXIII and presented him with his dossier that was published in a book by him about the history of contempt of Christians for Jews, kind of laying it all out through the centuries. And in that meeting, he said to John XXIII at the end of the meeting, he said, "Do I have any reason to hope that this council that you are calling will address this issue?" And John XXIII is said to have replied, "You have more than a reason for hope." In that same year, he met with 130 representatives from the United Jewish Appeal, who similarly kind of reminded him not only of what had happened in World War II, but the much longer history of the way Jews had been treated, and urging him to come up with a positive, healing statement about Jews and Judaism. So this is an overview about how the transformation begins to take place. Already before the council was called, so this is in 1959, he was elected in 1958. In 1959, as Lent was approaching, and those of you who know the Catholic liturgy, you know there's a series of prayers on Good Friday. You pray for the Pope, you pray for all Christians, you pray for other believers, you pray for the Jews, etc. And the language there is, we pray for the perfidious or faithless Jews, that God will remove the veil of ignorance from their eyes so that they will see and acknowledge Christ as Savior. And he said, we're not saying that. Perfidious is out, faithless is out. We're not saying that in the prayer, just on his own authority. He says, we're not saying that. So that was kind of the beginning of what he did. And then he turned to the person he appointed as the president of this newly created Secretariat for Christian Unity, Augustin Bea, who was a Jesuit, and who previously for about 20 years had been the director of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, so he had a scriptural background. And he said, I want you to take the lead during the council to address what was called the Jewish question. As some of you may know, John XXIII did not live to see the fruition of what he had set in motion. So at the first session of the council happened in the fall of 62, and John XXIII died in June of 63. So even before there was a discussion of the first draft of what became Nostra Aetate, he had passed away. And so his work had to be carried on. If it were to be carried on, at some point there was a question whether Paul VI would continue the council or basically just stop the council. Paul VI continued the work of the council and had to guide the church through some really thorny debates, not only theological, about what did the Catholic Church want to say about Jews and their responsibility for the passion of Christ, but also political questions. And that took on a very important point, especially for bishops who served in the Middle East. And they were cautioning against saying, we shouldn't make any positive statement about Jews and Judaism because it'll be interpreted as an endorsement of the Jews who are currently living in Israel, so the State of Israel established in 1948, but still in the 50s and 60s, ongoing kind of guerrilla warfare when guerrillas from Syria, Egypt, and Jordan would invade Israel, kill civilians, kill soldiers. Israel would return with reprisals. It was a very difficult situation. And the concern of some of these bishops was, namely, if we are seen as being positively saying good things about Jews, we can put Christians in the Middle East in jeopardy. Okay, so we had to navigate all of that. Successfully, it was navigated, and in the final session of the council in 1965, the text was approved by an overwhelming majority. I'm going to pull out a couple quotes here from Nostra Aetate that is known by its English title, The Declaration of the Relationship of the Catholic Church to Non-Christian Religions, because it also sets up the context in which this happens. So originally, the statement on the Jews was going to be a chapter in the decree on ecumenism. And then there were debates saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't quite fit there. We need to make it a separate document. And then there was a debate, once they had agreed by the end of the second, beginning of the third session, that it should be a separate document, the question was, well, we're just going to say something about Jews? Don't we need to say something about other religions? So the text expanded. And so in the first two sections, so I'm highlighting something from section 1 and then something from section 2, this sets the context, because I will present it this way, that namely, instead of the church kind of defaulting to what had been a habit, which was namely pointing out how the Roman Catholic Church was different from other belief systems, and because we Catholics had the fullness of truth, those who were not with us were simply in error, right? So we have all truth. You folks, unfortunately, don't have truth. And so instead of emphasizing the difference between religions, the statement wanted to talk about the unity of humanity coming from the same divine source, returning to the same divine source, and also pursuing in their various religions some of the very same questions that Catholics pursue. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? Why should we be moral, right? So that's the beginning of section 1. And then in section 2, it addresses the question of truth. And here you see the statement, the Catholic Church rejects nothing of those things which are true and holy in these religions. It regards with respect those ways of acting and living and those precepts and teaching, though different from what we teach, frequently reflect a ray of the truth which enlightens everyone. So what I would present to you is namely this change from we have the totality of truth, and unfortunately you have virtually none of it, to saying, no, we believe we have the fullness of truth, but we recognize that there is truth and goodness in other religions, which is a major, major development. In section 3, there's references to what the Catholic Church has in common and how they regard Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims. But the big section is really in section 4, which is the one that deals with the Jews. And here I want to highlight 3 points that are made in Nostra Aetate. First, and think about this was, 60 years ago. Now in theological circles, this idea is pretty commonplace, right? There's a common spiritual heritage that Christians share with Jews, right? We share a sacred book, at least part of a sacred book, right? And a moral code, etc. So that's the first thing that's important for us to recognize. And then the second, which was really important, is how do you deal with the question of culpability of Jews, either in Jesus' own time or today, for the passion and death of Jesus? And there were some very, very heated debates. As I was saying to a gentleman before we started, one of the bishops, I think it was Bishop Luigi Carli, had made the point saying, we cannot exonerate Jews from the death of Christ, and it's called deicide because Christians believe he's the Son of God, so it's killing God. We cannot exonerate him because Scripture won't let us do that. Read Matthew's Gospel, chapter 27, right? So it's present that Pontius Pilate is saying, do you want me to release Jesus to you? And it's like, no, we want Barabbas. And it's like, no, you sure? I don't find any fault with him. Don't you really want me to release Jesus? And it's, no, crucify him, crucify him. And then in Matthew's Gospel, this really horrific phrase, may his blood be upon us and our children, right? And so they were having this kind of debate. It's like, well, what do we do with our Scripture, right? So that became a really difficult issue. The majority won the argument and actually exonerated Jews as a group, both in the time of Jesus and today, from culpability for the passion and death of Christ. Some of the bishops were so inclined that they thought, in light of the harsh and terrible treatment that Christians, especially Catholics, had exerted upon Jews, they said, well, maybe we should also publicly ask for forgiveness. That did not go forward. One of the cardinals said, how about if we do this kind of in step? We'll ask for forgiveness and say we're sorry that we ever held them responsible for the death of Christ and the terrible treatment they received as a result, if they remove from the Talmud some of the negative Christian statements, right? So these are the kind of debates happening in the council. The third, what I regard as a really important point in Nostra Aetate, is to emphasize that the special relationship that God has had, for someone to use the past tense, has had with the Jewish people, has not been revoked. And this is a really, really major statement. And you see two different translations of the Latin, right? So for the sake of the patriarchs, God does not take back the gifts he bestowed or the choice he made, or a different translation. God whose gift and call are without regret. And this is a really important point, because it's going to kind of lead into this issue of, namely, is there a point of view that can be justified as Christian supersessionism? And that means, of course, that if God still regards the Jewish people as a special people with whom he has a special, unique, one could even say salvific relationship, then we cannot say that the Jews are accursed or rejected. So those are some of the key points from Nostra Aetate. So then, what happens at the conclusion of the council? So there are a series of first informal meetings between representatives of Jewish groups and members of the Roman Curia, leading to a more official meeting in 1970, where they agreed saying we should create a coordinating committee that can coordinate these dialogues at a high level between leaders of the Jewish people and the Catholic Church. And then Paul VI in 1974 created the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, which is still in existence today. And it's in the same structure since 1974. So this religious commission is part of the dicastery for the unity of Christians. And you might say, well, that seems really kind of odd. Part of the justification was that, namely, the relationship Christians have with Jews, or should have with Jews, is extremely close. And many of the Jews did not want to see it pulled out of that because they knew the people in the Secretariat for Christian Unity who were really committed to honest dialogue. So what I'm going to focus on now are the 4 documents that were produced by this Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. So these are the 4 major statements that have come out since the Second Vatican Council. And the first was on guidelines and suggestions for how to implement Nostra Aetate. And I'm going to pull out here, I think, 3 kind of key points. So the first point is, as you can see here in red, the Catholic Christians should attempt to understand Jews in their own terms. Now that might seem kind of common sense today, wasn't necessarily common sense in the 60s and 70s. So many Christians would deal with Jews from their perspective, which is often a partial understanding or misrepresentation or a caricature. And here the idea was that, namely, if we really respect them in dialogue, we have to try to understand Judaism on the basis of the essential traits which they used to define themselves and what's important to them, not what I as a Christian say. So that was important. The second had to do with what had also become very much a commonplace, was to draw a radical difference between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, between Judaism and Christianity. Judaism was represented, one could say misrepresented, as a religion that was based on fear of God and law and order and justice. Christianity is the religion of grace and freedom, right? And saying, this is really not only not helpful, it's not accurate. It's not accurate. And then the third point is there at the bottom, that although the Second Temple was destroyed, that did not mark the end of Judaism as a living religious tradition. Some of you who know St. Augustine from the 5th century, Augustine had interpreted or had explained why it was that Jews were dispersed throughout the world after the destruction of the temple and why they were wandering the world without having a homeland of their own. And he was saying, namely, so that they would serve as a witness to what happens to people who do not acknowledge Christ as Redeemer, right? And so that was the only function of Judaism then in contemporary times, is there to be a reminder. It's like, don't go down that path because this will happen to you. And saying, wait a minute. Judaism is a religious tradition with people that is a vital religion that still lives today. The second document came in 1985, and here it's focused more on what Catholics should or should not say when they preach about Judaism. And you'll notice, to set up the statements that are to follow, it makes this point that, namely, it's not simply a question of pastoral concern for this living reality, but it's important to address this relationship in a very dialogical, positive way, because the people with whom God formed a covenant, well, that covenant has never been revoked. God has not turned God's back on the Jewish people. So a second point that's important to raise, and once again, at least in theological circles, we take this as a given today, Jesus was and always remained a Jew. And although some of his interpretations of the Torah were at variance with the views of others, he respected the law, practiced the law in large parts, and wanted to invite others to respect it. You might recall that line that, namely, not one iota of the law will disappear until it has been followed. As a result, this document says that Jesus shared beliefs that were common with many Pharisees of the time, not only with regard to almsgiving and fasting, etc., but addressing God as Father, right? Or the commandment to love God and love your neighbor. Many Christians believe that that commandment is a uniquely Christian commandment, and it's just not true. Read the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, where it talks about, the Israelites are commanded to love God with their whole heart, mind, and soul. Leviticus 19, I think it's chapter 19, verse 18, talks about, and you should love your neighbor as yourself, right? So those are not unique to Christianity, and this document is trying to recognize that. With regard to dealing with the negative portrayal of Jews in the Gospels, and here I'm thinking primarily of the Gospel of John. The Jews then did this, and the Jews are plotting to do Jesus in, as if Jesus was not a Jew, and there's this kind of internal debate going on. What sense are we going to make of this man Jesus? And it says, we need to recognize, and here my interpretation of this, we need to adopt a contextual reading of the Scriptures. And if we do that, we'll probably come to the recognition that some of these things that project this kind of very negative view of Jews is a later development as those who follow Jesus and those who did not follow Jesus in the Jewish world were competing for adherence. You don't want to see people going off into a new religion. The new religion's trying to establish itself. And both of them were minority religions in the Roman Empire at the time that we're talking about. And so those tensions, in some cases, kind of get written back into the Gospels or implied in the Gospels. And this document recognizes that. So, I think this is the last point that I want to make with regard to the second document from 1985. And you can read this quote yourself, but it's saying, the permanence of the people of Israel has to be taken as somehow being God's will, God's design, right? It's not an accident, etc. And therefore, this idea that the Jews are people punished, preserved as the living argument for Christian apologetic, going back to Augustine, simply cannot be held. The third document, and so I'll point out the second document we just finished talking about, and the third document, were written during the papacy of John Paul II, and I'll have more to say about him in a couple minutes. Because John the 23rd opened the door, Paul VI created a commission that could keep the dialogue going, but it's really John Paul II who did a number of firsts that really cemented kind of the momentum of where the church was going. So as we were approaching the beginning of the third millennium, John Paul II was very keenly aware of saying, this is a good time for the church to acknowledge its past bad behavior with regard to whether it's other Christians or the Jews, etc., and to engage in an act of penitence. And so he insisted that he wanted the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews to make a specific document talking about the Holocaust, the Shoah. I won't go in a lot of depth here, but if you look at the language, look how carefully it is worded. And many of these documents are very, very carefully worded. So in this one, the document doesn't want to come right out and say, Christians are responsible for what the Nazis did and the destruction of 6 million Jews, full stop. So it makes a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And so as you can see in this quote, so the document says, well, think of anti-Judaism as dealing with Jews sort of as a class of people. It's sort of quasi-racial, right? If your mother's Jewish, et cetera, and it's people. Anti-Judaism is a belief or a series of beliefs that projects and presents Judaism in negative terms. So critical statements about Jewish ritual, food laws, et cetera, et cetera. And notice this last line here. So, although it doesn't want to take full responsibility for what Hitler and the Nazis did, it says this, but it may be asked whether the Nazi persecution of the Jews was not made easier by the anti-Jewish prejudices embedded in some Christian minds and hearts. And so John Paul II said, this is a call to penitence for the church. So you can see in this document, it's a call to penitence. And then he reiterates a statement that comes out of Nostra Aetate, so the last part that's in kind of a reddish font. The church deplores the hatred, persecutions, and displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews and notice this, at any time and from any source. And so, without going into a lot of detail, there were some leaders in the Catholic Church who didn't want to see this document go forward. So Bishop Marcel Lefebvre was one of them, et cetera, and there were others. And this, I take it, was also directed against them, right? So namely, we're not going to deal with that. John Paul II put this into practice. So in March of the year 2000, he made his trip to Israel. He met with the chief rabbis in Israel. He went to Yad Vashem. But what is very telling, and I know it's going to be probably hard to read all of this, he did what many people do who go to the Western Wall, so the wall that supported the terrace level where the temple was before it was destroyed, and inserts a prayer into the cracks of the wall. And the print on my screen is very small, so I'm going to read it from here because it's worth reading. God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. Okay. I think a very, very significant statement. It's one of a series of firsts, and I should pay attention to my time, a series of firsts that John Paul II is responsible for. So his first trip back to Poland, he goes to Auschwitz, right? And offers his respects and prays for those who have been murdered. First pope to go to a synagogue, but not only to go to a synagogue, this was in April of 1986, he went to the great synagogue of Rome. And it's in that context when he meets Rabbi Elio Toaf, the chief rabbi of Rome, he talks about Jews being the elder brothers of Christians. First pope formally and diplomatically to recognize the state of Israel at the end of 1993. First pope publicly to commemorate the Shoah at the Vatican. First pope to place a prayer, as we just saw, into the Western Wall in the year 2000. And the first pope to be really consistent and emphasizing that God's covenant with the Jewish people was never revoked. One of the reasons that I would submit to you that John Paul II was so open to appreciating and loving Jews was rooted in his experience. He was born and raised in Wadowice, Poland, a very small town about, I think, 20 or 30 kilometers southwest of Krakow. It was a town, depending on when you looked at it, but around the years that he was alive, population was probably never more than 12,000, of which about 2,000 were Jews. And so he got to know Jews on a personal level, went to school with some of them, acted in plays with some of them. You know, some think he had a girlfriend, a Jewish girlfriend, in the theater. You know, a fun story to tell about him is that sometimes the Jewish boys didn't have enough Jews to play on their soccer team. So when that happened, Karl Wojtyła, who became John Paul II, was the goalie on the Jewish team, right? And so it was just regular experiences with Jews and their families. Came to see it's like, they believe in God, they have great morals, they love people, they're committed to justice, they do all these great things. Why is it that so many terrible things are directed at them? So the personal experience is really, really important. Personal kind of side note that I have to put into this. So in light of what John Paul II did, a few of us wanted to create an exhibit to educate primarily the Catholic world about what John Paul II was doing to change this relationship, but also hoping that for, let's say, Jews who were not involved in theological dialogue, to recognize that, namely, what the church teaches and does is changing. So back in 2004, so the idea came from Yafa Eliak, now deceased, former professor at Brooklyn College, and was part of the commission that created the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She was a visiting professor at Xavier for one semester. And we had conversations. I was chair of the department at the time, and one of those conversations, she asked me, she says, Bill, do you think Catholics know that Karl Wojtyła had Jewish friends? I said, no, they don't know that. Do you think that they know that, namely, he's put into motion some major changes in this relationship? And I said, no, I don't think most Catholics know that. And her response to that was saying, we're educators, aren't we? Don't you think we should do something about that? And so that planted a seed. Eventually, so the others who were involved, you might recognize some of them. So Rabbi A.B. Ingber, who at the time was the head of the Hillel, he was the executive director of the Hillel Center here, stationed close to UC. Dr. James Buchanan, who was the longtime director of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue. Myself, at the time, I was chair of the theology department. Eventually, maybe I'm going too far into the weeds here. Eventually, we parted ways with Yafa, even though it was her idea, because her idea was she wanted to create an exhibit of pictures, of which she had lots, about her family, people who had been destroyed, shtetls that had been destroyed during World War II. We wanted it to be an experience. So we created an exhibit that had interviews with people who knew Karl Wojtyła as a boy, both Christians and Jews, knew him as a priest, knew him when he was Bishop of Krakow, etc., and put together this exhibit that traveled through the United States, starting here at Xavier in 2005, which would have been John Paul II's 85th birthday. So one of the things that you might see me, I had a beard back then, you might see me saying to the Holy Father was explaining the project and then ending with these fateful words. And we hope to launch this exhibit on this date in May in 2005 as an 85th birthday present to you. Those of you who know your dates know that he passed away in the preceding month in April. He never saw it. But he did send artifacts to the exhibit. So the cane he used to go to the Western Wall, the zucchetto he wore when he went to the Western Wall, he gave that to the exhibit. We were really happy when we were able to get the Vatican to agree to let us show the exhibit at the Vatican in 2015, which was then, kind of do your math, right? It was the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. And you can see in the left-hand picture one of the two semi-tractor trailers bringing in artifacts and panels, the big banner there. You might recognize the colonnades right in front of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. And at the end of the exhibit, I had the good fortune, together with Rabbi Ingber and Dr. Buchanan, to meet. This was the second time I had a chance to talk to Pope Francis, and we wanted to give him a gift from the exhibit because of his support of Jewish-Catholic dialogue and the special personal relationship he had with Rabbi Abraham Skorka from their time together in Argentina. Okay, that was my little aside about John Paul II. So the fourth document came out in 2015 on the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. The document repeats some of the points made in previous teachings, but also expands them or adds to them. So, for example, it's no surprise that this document says, without the Jewish roots, the church would be in danger of losing its anchoring in salvation history. Salvation history starts with the Jews, and that's the anchor that anchors Christianity in its beginning. But notice the language there on the left-hand side. To talk about this relationship, you might say in very visual terms. It says, well, we could say the Jews and Christians have the same mother, right? The Judaism of Jesus' time. And as a result, therefore, we can see Jews and Christians as two siblings. And then it says, well, and as siblings often do, they don't always agree. Sometimes they go their own independent paths, but we came from the same mother. Now, an additional piece that comes here is an explicit rejection of supersessionism. And supersessionism is this belief that, namely, the new covenant supersedes the old covenant and has replaced it, right? It's not just somehow an affirmation of the old covenant or a fulfillment of the old covenant. It's replaced it. And think about that language. Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant. And so this is very, very significant. In addition, it then draws the conclusion from that, namely, if we have the same mother, then today we can't even talk about Catholics having interreligious dialogue with Jews, because that would imply that they're really different from us. Maybe we can have interreligious dialogue with Muslims and Hindus, etc. But with them we can talk about it as an intrafamilial or an intra-religious dialogue because of how close this connection is. Therefore, this is continuing that conclusion, the Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion. With Judaism, therefore, we have a relationship which we do not have with any other religion. You are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way, it could be said that you are our elder brothers. And this is what, you'll see the picture there. So this is John Paul II greeting Rabbi Toaf outside of the Great Synagogue of Rome. Before going in, they both sat on the dais on either side. They prayed psalms, one after the other. But a very, very important statement talking about Jews being the elder brothers of Christians, which John Paul II repeatedly said throughout his papacy. So, we talk about the common root that we have in Abraham, and what does that mean? It says, well, consequently, the New Testament, which Christians believe in, can only be understood as an affirmation and fulfillment of the Old, not a replacement. Christians are therefore also convinced that through the New Covenant, the Abrahamic covenant has obtained that universality for all peoples, which was originally intended in the call of Abram. Now notice, that's a specifically Christian interpretation. I would submit to you, Jews do not see it that way, right? So that namely, Christianity is taking the universal message of Judaism, and now Christians are running with it, because what does that imply? And it at least raises the question, it's like, well then what's the mission of modern day Judaism, right? If somebody has now taken this mission about the universality of coming from one God and a moral code, etc., what happens? And that becomes the theological puzzle. So what you'll see here in this document, they trying to balance from a Catholic, not just Catholic, but Christian perspective, this belief that namely salvation comes through Jesus Christ, right? But then these statements about Jews, that God's covenant with them, special relationship hasn't been revoked, God is faithful, What do you do with that, right? So it says at the bottom there, the key line, that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable. Let that sink in. Theologically unquestionable. But how that can be, right, without Jews explicitly acknowledging Christ is a mystery. So if you can see the point, the document is trying to affirm two things which they don't know how well to reconcile. Saying, not only are Jews not accursed and rejected, they have a special relationship with God, and we believe that for them, in some way, it is saving and healing. But we also believe that Jesus, the Christ, is the way, the only way to salvation. What do you do with that? So they try. So what you'll see there on the left-hand side, right, there cannot be two ways to salvation based on our Christian belief. But notice in red, here we are confronted with the mystery of God's work, which is not a matter of missionary efforts to convert Jews, but rather the expectation that the Lord, that God will bring about that hour when we will all be united in recognizing God. So it leaves open the picture saying, we human beings can't explain how this gets reconciled, but we believe at the end of all of this, there'll be a way for God to find a way to welcome in all into redemption. On the right-hand side is a very important statement because even after the publication of Nostra Aetate, I think it's fair to say that many Jews were somewhat reluctant to engage in dialogue with Christians, with Catholics and other Christians. And the reason why is because they feared, it's like, you Christians only want to engage in dialogue with us because you're hoping to convert us. And if that's the point of dialogue, we don't want any part in it, right? So it took some time over several decades of people involved in the dialogue to get to know each other as human beings, to trust each other, etc., and saying, look, in this dialogue, my first goal is not to try to convert you to believe what I believe. My first goal is to try to listen to you, to understand what you believe, and to have it raise questions for me in terms of how do I understand my own faith, etc. Okay, so that becomes really, really important. So, oh my, how does this get manifested in prayer and in art? This will go a little bit more quickly. So the easiest way to show the changes is really to look at the Good Friday prayer. So here you can see the way the prayer was for many centuries. Let us pray for the faithless Jews, right, so that they would come to have this ignorance taken away from them and recognize Christ. Then we have the statement from Pope John the 23rd said, faithless, perfidious, all those terrible words, they're going to get pulled out. Then we get the development after these conversations between Catholics and Jews that when Paul VI authorizes the new Roman Missal, look at this prayer. Look how different it is, right? Let us pray for the Jewish people, the first to hear the word of God, that they may continue to grow in the love of his name and in faithfulness to his covenant. Very dramatic. Now, there was some concern during the papacy of Benedict, because Pope Benedict XVI, in response to Catholics who really liked the Latin Mass and the Tridentine literature, and he allowed going back to the Roman Missal of 1962, which in the Good Friday prayers, the title of the prayer when you're praying for Jews was, for the conversion of Jews. And then there was this whole question, is the Catholic Church going back on its dialogue, etc.? And so Pope Benedict had to clarify as best he could what he really wanted to say. And the form of the prayer that is most common today in Catholic churches is the one that you see here on the screen. And so not talking about we're praying that we can convert Jews, but we're praying that namely this loving, faithful relationship they have with God, may they continue to grow in it, right? May they continue to grow in it. And what is the church praying for? Hear graciously, God, the prayers of your church, that the people you first made your own attain the fullness of redemption. However that happens, right? May they attain the fullness of redemption. Okay, now we're going to talk about art. So I just have a few examples in terms of what you would find in some books from the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance period, etc. This first one is from the 12th century, And some of you know about illuminated manuscripts, so that they do nice for the first letter, and it gets really... So this is the letter Q in a book of sermons, and if you can look at the bottom, you can see a figure being stood upon by a figure holding a staff with a cross and a chalice representing the church. So ecclesia, who's being stepped upon? Synagoga, the synagogue. And notice synagoga has a blindfold, kind of emphasizing the blindness of Jews not recognizing Jesus. And that was fairly commonplace. This was also represented in stone. And I have two examples. This is from the cathedral in Strasbourg in the 13th century, and the second one is from Notre Dame, a very beloved church in Paris. And what you'll see here, once again, on the left-hand side is the church, staff with the cross, holding the chalice, crown, regal, right? We have triumph. Crown is gone from the synagogue, staff is broken, and it appears that synagogue is about to drop part of the Torah scroll from her left hand. In Notre Dame, similar, but in my view also worse, because here you'll see on the right-hand side, synagogue not only has a broken staff, is dropping either the Torah or, you might say from a Christian point of view, just the Ten Commandments out of her right hand. But if you look at the helmet that she's wearing, there is a serpent wrapped around it, which is a reference back to Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent deceives Eve into eating the forbidden fruit. And so basically, this is Satan. This is Satan, right? So this is what you would find in many, many churches in Europe. So in light of the fact that this relationship had changed, and this is when I was at St. Joseph's University, which has a very active Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations, we wanted to find a sculptor who could put into artistic expression the change in relationships, and that person was Joshua Kaufman. And there's the plaster version of it. And then it was turned into bronze. It's on the campus of St. Joseph's University. And what you'll notice there, both are wearing crowns. Both are at the same level, not one higher than the other. They're looking at each other and sharing the riches of their scriptural tradition. Torah scroll, New Testament, talking to each other, right? So there you get a kind of a clear representation of this transformed relationship. And of course, St. Joe's was really thrilled that when Pope Francis came to Philadelphia for the World Family meeting, he came to the campus and blessed the statues with his Jewish friend, Rabbi Abraham Skorka. Okay, final point, and I know I've gone a little bit too long. I want to go back to the importance of personal relationships, right? So Karl Wojtyła's closest lifelong Jewish friend was Jerzy Kluger. He was in Mr. Kluger's home. They went to school together. They played soccer together. They lost contact with each other during World War II, but regained it during the Second Vatican Council. At that point, Mr. Kluger was a businessman in Rome, and he heard the news being reported that someone by the name of Wojtyła had made a very interesting intervention at the council. And he goes, Wojtyła, I know of Wojtyła, right? And he actually finds out where he is, calls up, and they reunite their friendship. And until Jerzy Kluger passed away, he was a frequent visitor with John Paul II in the papal palace, having dinner together, talking about things that friends would talk about. A similar relationship developed between Pope Francis and Rabbi Skorka, as I mentioned. There you see a picture of them in Philadelphia when Pope Francis came to bless the statues. And so we end with Psalm 133, right? Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers, and we would add, sisters, dwell together. Thank you for your attention, especially since I realize I may have gone a little long. But Martin, we have time for probably, 15, 20 minutes of questions or comments.
We do. So I have a microphone for anybody who wants to raise a question. I can hear you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk and everything. A lot of traditionalists, which is not me, will talk about the hermeneutics of that there was not a rupture at Vatican II. And I always think the church has always evolved to better understand God. But there are people that want to say that the Catholic Church has never been wrong about anything. How do you communicate with the people that say, well, you know, the Council of Trent can't be wrong, and this flies in the face of what Catholic doctrine used to say, and things like that?
Yeah, I think what could be the most effective way to deal with that is to show textually that there has been an evolution in the church. I mean, the words are really important, right? So some people regard the Vatican II as a revolution. It's just a disruption with the past, which I don't think is an accurate picture, right? So there's a lot of continuity. You look at any of the documents, there's a lot of continuity with what had been previous teaching. But it evolves, and I'll give one example. So the Roman Catholic Church, to this day, has not rescinded the statement or the belief that salvation comes through Christ and that salvation is mediated by the church. It said it in the 12th century, the 15th century, the 16th century. It says it today. Well, then what, if anything, has changed? If you read the document that Dr. Madar talked about in the first presentation, so the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, known by its Latin title Lumen Gentium, what you see there is namely not that they throw that statement out, but they reinterpret church, right? So there's no salvation outside of the church that mediates Christ's presence. And so they said, well, their big view is all human beings are part of one human family from God. God wants all to be saved, right? And so all people are related to the church in some way. Some people are actual members, right? Explicit members. But then it says, well, there are others, and it goes through the list, and I can't, and Martin probably knows better than me. I don't know if it's section 16, thank you. Section 16 of the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church. It says, okay, so, you know, the Catholics who are in good standing with the church are full members of the church. Other Christians, right, have some of the means of salvation, and they're related to the church in a very close way. Other believers, Jews, are related to the church. Muslims are related to the church. And they conclude with a statement that some would say is quite an evolution, saying that even individuals who have no religious belief are related in a somewhat distant way to the church, but can be saved because if they follow the moral dictates of conscience, they can be saved. And we, Catholic Christians, believe that what enables them to do that is the Spirit of Christ. They don't say that, but we say that, and we see them as somehow related to the church. So I think that's the way to do it, is try to avoid the radical extremes in language. You know, nothing has changed, everything has changed. It's all revolution. No, but it is significant change, significant evolution.
Good evening, Dr. Madges.
Good evening.
Thanks for coming. My question is, for years, I've heard this term thrown around, and I've never had a really clear definition. Who exactly is a Semite?
Well, if I sort of, I can't quote it exactly. I think I like the definition of the ADL. So, I'm going to try, I'm not going to blame ADL for this, it'll be my own. So, it's referring to people who share the Semitic, see if I'm answering your question correctly. So the word Semite refers to people who share a kind of a common language core, the Semitic languages, right? That's where it originally came from, so Semitic languages and being an anti-Semite. As it developed in terms of kind of common parlance, it's referring to, very specifically, Jews as a class of people, right? So having a Jewish mother, etc. And so an anti-Semite is someone who, either in word, thought, or deed, is word or deed, attacking, undermining the dignity of Jews, or causing bodily harm or intending to cause bodily harm. If someone can pull out the ADL definition better than I can, they can maybe help me with this, because I like the way that they define that. But that would be the way that I deal with the question. And that's why it's important in terms of what I presented earlier to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, right? So anti-Judaism is this kind of negative view about certain aspects of Jewish belief or practice, without talking about Jews as a group, a class, et cetera, or talking about persecution or pogrom or any of that, et cetera. In our own day, as you know, and I don't want to go down this path, it becomes very, very complicated, because in terms of kind of political overtones, right? So someone says, well, what if someone says really negative things about the policies of the State of Israel? Is that person an anti-Semite? I will stay with the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council, the bishops had to be very, very careful, and they wanted to insist time and time again, saying, the statement we are making has to deal with our religious relations to the Jews. It is not a political statement, right? It's not a political statement. You want to help me out with an ADL definition?
Well, I don't know the ADL definition.
How would you define it?
I work for American History, so if you were...
Let Jay.
Taking your question as it relates to how we understand modern-day anti-Semitism. Modern-day anti-Semitism, or at least the term itself, was founded and really popularized by a German journalist who tried his hand in politics in the late 1800s, 1870s, to essentially give a pseudo-scientific legitimacy to his Jew hatred, which is why, as we look at the evolution of anti-Semitism or Jewish persecution, the Nazis and the understanding that, or at least the declaration that Jews are this race of people that need to be annihilated, essentially comes from there. So as it relates to Semitic people, the term anti-Semitism actually has no connection. So when you hear people say, as the professor just shared, Palestinians, or you just look at people of the Levant are Semitic, so how can someone be anti-Semitic? It's actually not applicable there, if that helps.
Good. Thank you.
And I would like to take off from your comment about art, because the examples you gave were, in a sense, safely medieval. A year ago, I spent 2 weeks in my ancestral homeland, the Rhineland, and in an art museum in Cologne, something just hit me. It was devoted primarily to portrayals of Mary and Jesus, young Jesus. And every single one had curly blonde hair and blue eyes. Mm-hmm. And in some reading I did when I got home, it said occasionally Joseph will come out in the Jewish costume, but you don't see that with Mary and Jesus. And I could not but ask myself, how much easier did that make the Shoah? Mm. How many Christmas cards clearly portray rejoicing at the birth of a Jewish baby? And how many of them portray rejoicing at the birth of somebody who looks just like us? Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of creeping discrimination or denial of the facts that blinds us, I think, to the openness that you've been calling us to.
Thank you, Michael. And, it's kind of interesting, during the rise of National Socialism in Germany, there were attempts by German authors to present Jesus as an Aryan. So it's, not just baby Jesus, but the adult, that, he wasn't Jewish at all. This was the Aryan Jesus. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say, because how well you presented it tonight, what a joy, a treat with all the stuff we hear out there. and all the illogical stuff, all the opinions, but you just presented it with all kinds of backup, and I just think that the teaching authority of the church. Somebody a while ago asked me why I was Catholic, and I always bring that up. I graduated from X a long time ago, but the teaching authority of the church is what you're doing all the way back. 3 popes, supported Vatican II. Who did that? That was the Holy Spirit. I think it's the only way it could have gotten as far as it's gotten. But I think it's such a pleasure here, making sense, and looking at it different ways, like you just don't hear today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I mean, just to emphasize that point, so it wasn't just John Paul II, it was also Benedict and Francis, who followed the example of John Paul II, met with the chief rabbi of Rome, went to the great synagogue of Rome, etc., and wanted to continue that tradition of showing at a very high level these close bonds.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Madges. That was really beautiful. You emphasized the importance of personal relationships that popes have had with Jewish friends that were very influential. How has the personal relationships in your own life, through the work that you've done, shaped your own faith and contributed to your own wisdom and
Thanks,
gifts that you
Elizabeth.
bring
Really
to
nice
us?
question. Yeah, so in a variety of ways. So I'll just mention a few of the benefits that I had. So going back to, it's now 16 years ago, I was invited by some very kind Jews to see if I would like to participate in a program called the Christian Leadership Institute. And it was an effort, largely AJC was involved, et cetera, to have people who are recognized as having some kind of leadership position that are engaged in dialogue, who could go and would go to Jerusalem in 2 successive summers and sit down and read Jewish texts with Jewish scholars and learn from them in terms of, it's this idea of, namely, don't try to learn about another religion, no matter what it is, by simply reading books about it. But it was like, this was, for 2 weeks, every day, doing Havruta, talking afterwards in meals, and getting to know the scholars as human beings and learning the tradition to them and seeing it with new eyes was really important. Important friendships. So I've had a good relationship with Rabbi A.B. Ingber. It began on a very emotionally difficult way in 2002. We were part of a delegation that drew individuals, so and you know this because it goes back to Rabbi Signer from Notre Dame. It was his idea to bring people together. But bringing together students and faculty from the United States, mixed group, Christian and Jew, Germany, and Poland, and meet at Auschwitz for a week, right? And not just, walk through the camps together and just be overwhelmed by that, particularly Birkenau. But then sitting with each other and hearing people tell stories about their families. Some of the Germans saying, yeah, I had family members who were in the Nazi party. People asking for forgiveness. And seeing it being given by some of the Jews that were there who had lost family members. Very moving. Let me just leave it at those 2 examples.
Thanks again, and thanks for entertaining a second question or observation. I'm a Catholic school teacher, and one of my colleagues, just to back up what you're talking about, they have a program, I guess it's through the U.S. bishops, and I forget exactly which cardinals or archbishops might be involved, but it's called Bearing Witness, and it teaches school teachers about how to present Judaism to people, which is really cool. And we have a school in the diocese called John the 23rd, and you might say audaciously, but unapologetically on the website it says, Pope John the 23rd or Saint John the 23rd now, open the Second Vatican Council. Anyway, my question though is, and maybe it's, I don't know how you want to answer it because I don't want to say it's political, but it seems like a lot of the countries outside of the United States, including Italy and some other ones, really do a whoopla for Vatican II, and yet we're kind of lukewarm to it. Is it because, what's unique about our country that makes us a little bit more hesitant to embrace Vatican II and things like this?
So I would first say I want to be very careful about making blanket statements, right? So in generalizations, why do Americans, are they lukewarm to Vatican II? Because I don't think all American Catholics are lukewarm to Vatican II. Some of the divide is along generational lines, so I'll speak for myself. So I have lived through the church both before Vatican II and after Vatican II, lived through the changes, and for me that council was life-giving. I think for some people who don't, I heard someone in one of our earlier sessions say, oh yeah, people in my parish, when you mention Vatican II, they go, who cares? I think, I would guess that for some people, what they see Vatican II doing is blurring the distinctiveness of the Roman Church, right? Because, and this is, now I'm going to make a really crystal clear picture that's not that clear. But it's sort of like, beforehand it was really clear, it's like Catholics really didn't read the Bible. Why do we need to read the Bible? Because the magisterium will tell us what it says and they'll teach us, etc. You don't need to do that. In our liturgy, we go to Mass. In the pre-Vatican II days, a large part of our involvement in Mass was at least semi-passive, right? We're observing the sacred actions of the priest. Remember, the priest had his back to us, etc. Things like, from the medieval times where ringing the bells came from. It's like when people were illiterate, what are they doing in the medieval churches? They're looking at the stained glass windows that have biblical stories, and that's how they learn about some of the things in Scripture, because they can't read. So if you're doing this, when you get to the high point of the Mass, the consecration, you ring the bells to get their attention. And so a lot of that changes, and some people say, well, Catholic worship is now more similar to some Protestant services, particularly if you think about Lutheran services, Episcopalian services. We have Catholic Bible study groups. How are we so different? And so if there's any truth to that, I think what it is that in us generally, human beings generally, we like markers that help define us because it relates to identity. And if somehow the markers get blurred, it's unsettling. And so some people say, let's go back to what was a long, long tradition. We did everything in Latin, we did et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because there were clear definitions. And if you belonged to that church, you had a very clear identity. And it's comforting.
We have time for one more question, if there is one.
What do you hope or foresee happening next in the future for Catholic and Jewish relationships, and what role do you see parishioners playing in that?
What I think will happen is that the dialogues that have already happened that tend to be in relatively small groups of people who are not only interested, but are also fairly well-read in their own tradition. I think that may gradually spread out a little bit to other people who are not engaged in it and be invited into that. And the way into it, I think, would be, I think our current situation in the world might provide the context for giving the impetus for that, because it's saying, look, we live in a world that is so terribly divided. whether it's politically, religiously, culturally, etc., wouldn't it be good if we could find ways of actually meeting people who are different from us in some important ways, and learn about them so we can live in this one world together? And, to use the Jewish phrase, and we can work together on healing the world. Tikkun olam. But I think that's going to be a process, because it's really hard in the current climate that we're in, but I think that can happen. It will happen more quickly if there is clear, dynamic leadership, not only from Pope Leo, who's already begun that. I mean, I think it was within a day of his election, he reached out to Rabbi Noam Marins, whom I also know, and who's now the Director for Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee, and wanted to say, I want to continue down this path that was created by my predecessors. So not only on that level, right, because how many Catholics are paying attention on a regular basis to what's the latest thing being said at the Vatican? But if it gets also said by local bishops, bishop conferences, that namely, this is important. And if you think about something like this in terms of younger people today, the Shoah is ancient history. Some it's like, what happened? What? 1940? Well, that was 85 years ago. I mean, that's prehistoric history. And so, when memory of some of those horrific things is lost, then there might be less interest in saying, what can I do to contribute to a world in which that becomes less possible, right? The other thing is, I'm kind of in no particular order, the other thing that just comes to my mind as I'm saying this in terms of how important it is that when we see things that are simply wrong, let's say just from a Christian perspective, I'll use that one, to not be a bystander, but be an upstander. There's the famous phrase from the Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, right? So it goes something like this. When they came for the socialists, I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I didn't speak up. I wasn't a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up. I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one to speak up for me. So I hope, some of those things, a lot, teachers, I say a lot is in the hand of teachers to help students kind of engage these issues. So if teachers are doing it from the ground up, if parents are doing it from the ground up, if leaders are doing it from the top down, then I think we might see things continuing to move in a really healthy and helpful way. Again, thank you very much for your attention.
And just one last comment. Our next presentation is October 16th, Thursday, here at 7 p.m. The topic is religious freedom. Okay. I hope to see you there, here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. No, it's all good. It's all good. We have time. And, it's wonderful.